Welcome everybody to Yale Centre for British Art's online series At Home, Artists in Conversation. I'm Clarrie Wallis, I'm Senior Curator of Contemporary British Art at Tate, and I'm delighted to welcome Veronica Ryan to our programme today. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping notes. Please note that this programme will be recorded. Your camera and sound are muted and will remain so throughout the programme, and we will be using the Q&A feature located on your navigation bar to gather your questions for Veronica, and they will be answered at the end of the programme. Please feel free to submit questions at any time during the programme. Yale University acknowledges the Indigenous people and nations, including the Mohican, the Machintuki Pequot, the Eastern Pequot, Skahincot, the Golden Hill Pogeset, and the Nihatic, and the Kincaicuk, and other Algonquin people who have stewarded through generations the lands and waterways of what is now the state of Connecticut. We honour and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these people and the nations and this land. I'm going to start just by giving you a brief introduction to Veronica Ryan. So Veronica was born in 1956 in Plymouth in Montserrat and raised in England, and creates meticulously handcrafted work using a wide range of materials, including bronze, plaster, marble, textile, and found objects. Her sculptures and installations examine environmental and socio-political concerns, personal narratives and memories, as well as the wider psychological implications of history, trauma, and recovery. Ryan studied at St Albans College of Art and Design, Bath Academy of Art in Corsham Court, the Slade School of Art at University College London, and SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies at London University. Over her 40-year career, she's been the subject of numerous exhibitions and residencies within the UK, the US, and abroad. Her first one-person exhibition was at Arnolfini in Bristol in 1987. Other important shows have been presented at Kettle's Yard, Cambridge in 1988, Camden Art Centre, London in 1995, the Aldrich Museum in 1996, Selina Gallery, Brooklyn in 2005, Tate St Ives in 2000, 2005 to 2017, the Mattress Factory, Pittsburgh, 2011, the Art House and the Art House, Wakefield, Yorkshire, England in 2017. Ryan has been the recipient of many awards and prizes, including most recently the 2019 Pollock Krasner Grant and the 2018 Freelands Award, which supported her exhibition Along a Spectrum on Spike Island in Bristol in the summer of 2021. Her work is in many private and public collections, such as the Arts Council Collection, the Contemporary Art Society, the Hepworth Wakefield, Sainsbury's Collection, Tate's Collection, and the Wellcott Collection at the Irish Museum of Modern Art. In June 2020, the Hackney Council commissioned Ryan to create a public artwork celebrating London Borough's Windrush generation, the first permanent public sculpture to do so in the UK, which was unveiled in October 2021. Ryan created a series of large marble and bronze sculptures representing Caribbean fruit and vegetables. On her inspiration, she said, "I have memories of going to Ridley Road Market with my mother as a child to buy fruit and vegetables, fabric, and sewing materials. Little did I know that these early experiences would become essential material for my practice as an artist. I remember as a toddler during the 1950s, the difficulties my young, hopeful parents from Montserrat dealt with, navigating a new country and often inhospitable circumstances." Veronica, welcome. It's such a delight to have the opportunity to talk to you about your practice. If we can go to the first slide, I'd really just like us to start by talking a little bit about, you're talking about your early memories of visiting Ridley Road Market as a child to buy fruit and fabric with your mother. Is it fair to say that a lot of the work did evolve from your experience of growing up with your family in the 1950s and post-war Britain?
Yes, I think that for me, essentially, I've recognised that my early experiences have really contributed considerably to my practice as an artist. The work has moved through different areas of practice, moving in and out of an interest in seeds and fruit and foliage, plant structures, and also organic when I say organic, also thinking about the fact of Montserrat having the volcano, and thinking about loss and disintegration and so on. So there's been a pivoting around of different concerns in the work.
I mean, I loved it when we were talking before, and you were just talking about the significance of the market, which is where it's wonderful about having this permanent commission unveiled, and for those of you in the States who don't know about Ridley Market, it's in the heart of Dalston, and it's been a market since the end of the 19th century. Veronica, did you want to say a little bit about why Ridley Road Market is so important in terms of the different communities who have actually used the market and how it's influenced it?
Well, when I was invited to put a proposal forward for the Hackney, the Windrush Commission in Hackney, I was a bit anxious because my work isn't overtly political, but I do work around the subtext of, psychological, sociopolitical, and, environmental factors and so on. So I spent a bit of time trying to think about how I might put forward ideas that relate to Hackney, and thought that my early experience going shopping with my mum to Hackney Market, and it was something I was aware of amongst the adults, where they would go and buy fabric and fruit and veg and fish and meat and so on. And so I saw a connection with me as a child, and understanding, one was always aware of adult conversations, and, you could pick up when there was, kind of stuff that was quite traumatic going on. I was always aware of, I think in terms of memory, how far my memory informed what I remembered. So I remembered, for example, holding the pushchair while my younger sister was in the pushchair, and just holding on to it, and just remembered things like teddy boys and, some of the kind of ruptures in London. And so, but also connecting that with Windrush and, shopping, and, the fact of adults having difficulties with the environment and so on. And in retrospect, of course, I've been able to make all those connections with early experience of movement from the Caribbean to England. So that's the kind of world I grew up really in. And I thought that one of the things about Ridley Road Market was, yams and sweet potatoes. And there's the other thing that people often confuse yams and sweet potatoes as being both the same thing. And I'm quite interested in, how one identifies different cultural paradigms, that everyone from the Caribbean and different islands don't have the same cultural landscape, for instance. And so, I'm always a bit anxious about a sense of a monolithic dimension, and a way of not, for instance, thinking about the fact that Montserrat had the British and the French and the Irish, and that St. Kitts, for example, had a different group of people, invading different islands and so on, Indian population and Chinese and so on. So different islands have different kinds of historical moments. And also just thinking about Hackney and that the family, and I always lisp when I try to remember the Lodgages family who brought palm trees. When you're in outside the town hall, the Hackney Town Hall, there are these lovely palm trees. And so I felt that there was a way that I could connect with some of the history in Hackney. And so the choice of fruit and vegetable, which features in my work, also connect with part of the history of Hackney as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a phenomenally successful piece of kind of public sculpture. I mean, the scale of them is just perfect in the way that they sit within the square. And I've been past them on quite a few occasions since the unveiling in October. And what I think is so great about them is seeing the way that you also have children in particular, kind of interacting with them, and then realizing then that, in terms of thinking about them as kind of, sculptural objects. I mean, congratulations. I just think it's, it's a wonderful, wonderful piece. I know that you, I have a sense that your mother instilled in you a very kind of from an early age, a kind of a curiosity about, craft and making. And I know that later on we want to talk a little bit about the significance of kind of sewing and patchwork and that sort of sense of which are kind of skills that you learnt, I think, from her. If we can go to the next slide, I wanted to really just start by talking a little bit about the kind of the context within which you found yourself deciding that you actually wanted to go to art school, and to ask you just to say a little bit about your experience, first of all, of studying, where you were at St Albans, and then you moved on to the Bath Academy. And then from that, you're then moving to actually studying at the Slade. And wonder if you could just talk us through a little bit again about what it was like studying sculpture during the 70s and then moving into the early 80s.
Well, St Albans was a foundation course, so typically foundation courses give introductions to different disciplines: printmaking, sculpture, painting, ceramics, and so on. And I really liked ceramics, and I was sort of been encouraged to think, oh, well, did I want to move into ceramics or sculpture? And so John Mills was the head of sculpture at the time, and he was very encouraging about some of the structures I was making, and sort of was very influential in encouraging me to move towards sculpture. When I went to Corsham, it was a fine art course which also included another subject. So my other subject was printmaking. And I did a lot of etching as well as making sculptures. And I was always disappointed that I couldn't continue or didn't have a press, an etching press when I left college, but find actually, looking over work, that my drawings really incorporate a kind of printmaking modality. And so although I didn't have, the chance to continue printing, there were other ways that it came into the practice. And also there was a very good ceramic department at Corsham as well. So I was able to incorporate some ceramic structures with some of the sculptures. Corsham was, I went to have a look at the place when I applied, and it was so different to anywhere I, at that point, experienced. The Lord Methuen house was still on offer to Corsham. It had a 99-year lease, and so there were peacocks in the grounds, and it sort of felt like this very sort of very strange but beautiful environment. We did our complementary studies in the house, and then the studios were, sort of little hut-like structures. I thought it was quite a formal department, that people really liked Brancusi and David Smith in particular. And so I just remember this very purist kind of notion of purity and sculpture and form. I remembered it was difficult for some of the women artists at that point who wanted to explore issues around, the female body and, menstruation and so on. And it wasn't really seen as subject matter that one could deal with in sculpture. So early on, there were quite a lot of conflicts about which was, about materials and subject and so on. And I had a difficult time in the first year. I think partly going to a very different kind of environment, and then there were sort of issues around with some of the students that I didn't really quite understand, that I sort of felt sort of separate and apart from the place. And in retrospect, I could see that moving, through an environment where, I was the only non-white artist for a number of years in Corsham, but there were, other kind of modalities around that was very consequential, in fact, and had quite a lot of impact really in the first year. But had some of the tutors were very sympathetic, understood different identity issues in terms of young students leaving home. So there were a lot of different factors that came into being a young student in a very different environment. So that really was something that came into the early work. So the piece on title was really about a kind of precarious, objects fallen, and they kind of related to ball structures. I was beginning to look at art and Giacometti also, and thinking about balance and beginning to think about things disintegrating or not being very structured. But also there's also a pineapple in one of the sculptures in the back as well. So I was already beginning to think about forms and particular kinds of identifiable objects, but at that point not really clear what the intentions were.
Yeah, and then on the right hand side we have a picture of a work that you made at the Slade, which I think it's fair to say that your experience of going there was where you're actually more within feeling with that you're within a culture of kind of self-led experimentation. And this work here, in terms of describing it, we have it's kind of painted plaster, and then we sort of, which are kind of then wrapped around very different kind of particular objects, and you then starting kind of very early experimentation of containing objects within trays and boxes. So this kind of this wrapping with materials, with thread and twine and wool. Can you tell me a little bit about these? And also, I know that you really relished the fact that when you were at the Slade, that it has very kind of close proximity to the British Museum, and that also allowed you to spend time in the Egyptology department, and was the beginning really of your interest in votive objects and shrines.
Well, first of all, that yellow is the actual colour of that plaster. It's called Caffady. I think it's also called something else now, but that's what it was called when I was using it at the time. It's also a very hard plaster, so, it's quite good working with it on these, this very thin layers of plaster that I covered. So I made structures that had seeds and ginger, and I was also at that time collecting avocado skins as well. I just like the way mango seeds too. I think I just collected I like the structures and how they dried and so on. And so I made little kind of wooden doweling around them and was wrapping them in threads, because I could see in retrospect that because I'd grown up with threads and needles and so on, that just seemed a natural extension of a way to combine structures. So at that point I was thinking about how one could contain things without nailing structures together. So binding was very much a way that I could contain structures. And so I wanted to see how I could make a container for these structures. So started to make these tray-like forms, which I suppose at that point were rather like domestic trays, in fact, but the scale of them wasn't really domestic. We're not really getting a clear enough idea from the picture, but the slide, but they're kind of slightly longer than domestic trays. And I wanted to combine them, I was beginning to think about ritual objects and about the way somehow one could evoke sort of eternal states, really. So I think these were quite a lot about process and how one could begin to evoke a sense of momentum. And I at the time, Lawrence Gowan was the professor at the Slade, and he was very intrigued by these. He had friends in London University and University College who were anthropologists and so on, and an African art historian. So he introduced me to one of the African art historians, and they were all intrigued that I was making these ritualized kinds of binding structures. And so I got a letter to go to the Museum of Mankind and I was beginning to look at a lot of undocumented objects. So a lot of the undocumented objects were very fragile structures. There was seeds and so on. There were masks with seeds in. And at that point, a lot of the objects, I don't know what's happened to the Museum of Mankind in Shoreditch right now, but they also had little tags on which described the region they came from. And I was at that point really intrigued that they were on shelving structures. And it's only later on in more recent work that I started using shelving. And then it was reminding me, my first interest in shelving was really coming from spending time in the Museum of Mankind.
So interesting. I also think, I know that, that following this, that you also had this kind of traveling scholarship, which then enabled you to visit Nigeria. And there is that kind of sense for me about, or wondering whether this is the beginning at a point of an interest in repurposing of everyday objects for kind of spiritual purpose, and that kind of sense of starting to think about really, quite, whether you sort of at that point started to notice sort of formal correspondences with your own natural kind of practice.
Well, at that point, I got a nice boys' scholarship to go to, I wrote a proposal, I got this scholarship to go to Nigeria, and the intention was to look at undocumented objects in the museums. And so at that time, Dr. Ekpo Ayo was the director of the museum in Lagos. And so I met him in Nigeria, and then he wrote letters of introduction to some of the other museum directors in Ife, Ibadan, and Jos. And of course, at that point, we didn't have smartphones and so on. And the telephones, they had telephone boxes, but they didn't all connect with different regions, from the south to the north. And so I was waiting for letters so that I could visit the different museums. So my work at the Slade was, that intention of going to explore museum stores. So one of the things that was really interesting in Lagos and going to some of the villages was you would see little votive offerings to ancestors, and then one of the farms we visited, you would see little objects sort of tied to trees, and I gather that some of these were to good karma for trees to grow, and so I was really interested in the way that objects were used that looked like sculptures to me, but these objects had a function, for good growth and so on. So I saw connections with the way I work and a kind of psychological underpinning of, making some of these ways of external ways of exploring internal states.
Yeah, that's exactly what I have, that kind of very, very strong sense with your practice. It's fascinating. If we can move on to the next slide, I wanted to just quickly really talk a little bit about this kind of period then kind of coming back in the mid-80s, and about, you've often described about on a day-to-day basis about how you like to be occupied with making things. And I think much of the work for me seems to be very much about the touch or handling of stuff in the world, which is also very interesting in terms of you thinking about votive objects and about, and in some ways the work can also be understood as having its roots in Artie Pover and certain types of kind of post-minimalist work. I know that Eva Hess, for example, seeing the show that Nicholas Serota curated at the Whitechapel in the 70s was hugely important. But I also think there are really quite strong and interesting connections between your work and New British sculpture. I don't want to dwell on this for too long because I'm mindful of time, but I think it is useful just to acknowledge that how generally in the 80s that there was a real notable return to the wide use of techniques of kind of fabrication and the use of metaphor, and how traditional subject materials and methods such as carving and stone and also kind of came back in the work of a number of artists, and about how figurative and sort of metaphorical imagery reappeared together with sort of, kind of poetic or evocative titles. So by that, I'm thinking of people like Richard Deacon, Anish Kapoor, Alison Wilding, Cragg, Anthony Gormley and Bill Woodrow. And with all of them, there does seem to be a kind of, Gormley was actually, I think, I can't remember if he was a year above you or below you at the Slade.
Above me at the Slade.
Yeah. So just that sense of thinking about this idea about object and image and the idea about metaphor that I think comes very strongly through, and an interest also in a sort of intergenerational dialogue or sort of these shared concerns that were emerged with different artists across different space and time. And on the right hand side, we have a work which you made, which was really for an incredibly important show that you made with Jenny Lomax at Camden Arts Centre, which again sort of shows the kind of influence. In this case, I think really thinking about Judd was significant as well. Would you just like to say a little bit about these two photographs?
So I started making this work, Fragment of Things, or started to explore more fragments of things when I was offered a year artist fellowship residency with Kettle's Yard and Jesus College. And so it was really good to have a year where I could have a lot of time to explore some of the ideas that were coming into the work, which was really a bridge between the plaster and I was using lead foil and wrapping things. And I was reading Monuments and Maidens and the idea of sieves not sieving, and I was making sculpture as well. There was one piece called Perforations, which I made in bronze, and it was like a series of sieves which sort of grew incrementally. So, it was stopped up, it wouldn't sieve. So I've always been really interested in kind of metaphorical references. So this Fragments of Things, the sieve, one of the sieves had feathers in, one other sieve I cut the top off, the handle off, and it's got dried feathers. And there's another, the tea
strainer?
The tea strainer, the small one hanging, had hair in it. And so, it's often, I was interested in part of this metaphorical reference was also really related to the body and about kind of dysmorphic, kind of a sense of dislocation and trying to think about the body politic and the body being kind of a disintegration and so on. So also I was really interested in the way that lead foil is, is a sort of potentially dangerous material, but it's so beautiful
as well, isn't it, though?
Really beautiful, and that according to how thin it was rolled out, you would have these beautiful satin-like colours, moving from mauves and purples. So I really like that connection with the actual material, the history of lead, that kind of something beautiful with something poisonous as well. So those were some of the occupations. And the empty compartments full of dust I had made when I first went to New York, and then later showed it at Camden. But around that particular time, I had a young baby and I was collecting baby white boxes. So they came in various colours. So the ones I liked particularly were pink ones, because it was such a vivid pink. So I just stacked them and, just reused them in various ways. I like the idea that growing up, my mother reused and repurposed different things around the house. And actually that was one of my experiences going to Nigeria as well, that evaporated milk cans were often used to make little lamps. So, basic welding a little funnel in the top and then a wick, with oil made little lamps. And so I've always been interested in how one could, through slight modifications, make something from everyday objects which took on another function, sometimes as a functional object, but also which there's something quite beautiful about the structures as well. And so the first studio I had in New York was just off the Bowery, and I was really fascinated by the industrial restaurant shops where, you know, people bought all their cooking and baking facilities. So I like these extended bread bins, in fact, and I was covering the pink baby white boxes in plaster, and I was covering some of these kinds of stainless steel bread bin structures with plaster. This piece in particular, I was of course reading Christova, but also thinking about Mary Douglas earlier. Yes. And of course it all relates in a sense to my interest in Winnicott and Melanie Klein earlier on, but then thinking forward, moving on from the baby understanding about the bad and, you know, good and bad object, primarily the breast, and thinking about the baby's connection with its environment and separation from the mother, integrating good and bad. So, you know, the part of making things and thinking about the way that babies, you know, suck their thumb or have a dummy or suck the ends of a blanket. So I, in a way, thinking about transitional objects in that sense. And so, in a way, making these, I realised that my work moves around different kinds of interconnected paradigms. So
that's what one of the things I think is really, really interesting when I think. I mean, it's fascinating in terms of thinking about the work in relation to Christova and Mary Douglas. And also I was very struck by Dorothy Price when she talked about your work in the really fantastic catalogue that accompanies the exhibition at Spike Island, where she talks about how your work and how there is this concern with the abject and with borders and boundaries of matter and of psyche, and the tipping points in which one state might turn into its other, and in doing so posing a threat to the ego. I thought that was a really, you know, beautifully articulated way of actually thinking about your work. I mean, if we were to move on to the next slide, then I think it's also really interesting in terms of thinking about the interconnectedness of your approach, which I think is really, really significant. And I know that in some ways, well, you've talked about the interconnectedness or interest in that in relation to kind of root systems and this sort of the sense of the rhizomatic. And I think that what I've always experienced with your work is that there are multiple non-hierarchical entry points in terms of thinking about your practice. And I think that's also kind of reflected in generally your interest in organic forms and in seeds and in the cycle of the natural world. I wanted to just ask you a little bit about these works and about your relationship to landscape and sort of sense of homeland, and thinking about whether the different landscapes of Cornwall and Plymouth, Montserrat, and how they've sort of influenced your work.
So I drew quite a lot initially before making some of the landscape structures, and was thinking quite a lot about the space between things. I was quite preoccupied about notions of boundaries and sort of psychological spaces. And one of the things about some of these organic structures is also the way that some of the forms in some of the sculptures are bronzes, that this one connects with most closely as relics in the Pillar of Dreams. And so once some of the structures were cast into bronze, that they also took on bullet-like structures. So a connection between something which is very beautiful, inherently beautiful, but something which could also contain its opposite as well. So that was something that was really important, but also thinking about the way we're dealing much more now with climate change and the sort of looking at floods and these fires and devastation. And I think experiencing the volcano in Montserrat, but also thinking about trauma around. So we have the land, the environmental trauma, but also making connections with people and internal traumas, which manifest in various ways. So,
In a bit, we'll come on to the idea about trauma and healing, but I also think with these ones, I mean, if we can go to the next slide, I think it's also just very interesting in terms of, I know that you talked about working a lot with using kind of avocado trays, because that was also at a point where actually was quite a struggle financially in terms of thinking about materials, but also about how these forms, and this is a kind of a relatively recent work, but you can see the connections again, how you have this sense of kind of strata and landscape, but also how very beautifully reference histories of global trade, as well as this idea about, you know, this sort of sense of how things, objects or fruit or people move around and they also seem to speak very much to, you've talked about this concept of germination, which I loved very much about the interest in seeds, and you thinking about that in relation to how things or people find their own habitat and kind of germinate. So what is it? What are the conditions in order for seeds or people to thrive? So there's a lot in that, but just think, you know, just just good if you could touch on a few of those elements. I guess it's about, you know, thinking about Gulf streams as well.
Yeah. Well, you've really encapsulated a lot of the thinking around the work. And one of the things is that when I'm making work, that whole materiality that has become quite a question about some of the recent work that's always been there, is that so I think it's my worldview that informs the kinds of choices.
Yeah.
So thinking about one of the first things that was really interested about when I first came to New York was seeing a lot of apple packing cushions, which I was mentioning the other day, are like jiffy bags, but are not jiffy bags, it's just a cushion and then apples stacked on those. And so it made me think of pillows, actual pillows, and the fact that my mother used to embroider our pillowcases. And then she talked about the fact of growing up as a girl in Montserrat and how people repurposed flour sacks, which would have been very good quality cotton, and embroidered those and made those into beautiful pillowcases. So I think some of my initial interest around pillows and landscape and so on came out of some of those early recollections from my mother and seeing her embroider. So one of the things I did with these apple cushions was I pierced them with pins. So I've got a whole load of stacks of these apple packing cushions all over the place. And then I started collecting some of these avocado trays. Also, egg trays are so beautiful. You know, when stacks of egg trays and different kinds of fruit trays. But I also really like the structure of these avocado trays. And so in different shops, they would have different coloration. And I like the fact that there was a kind of community aspect in terms of the relationships that I had with some of the people in various shops. So in some shops, people were very accommodating and would save some of the boxes, trays, and they would let me know the best time to collect them. And then other people just said, oh no, we throw them away, and sort of looked at me disparagingly, wondering why on earth would I want avocado trays. So it was interesting kind of building up these sort of relationships with people, but also thinking about this whole culture around avocados. I remember when we went to Montserrat for a little while, the way that avocados, there's so many different kinds, and also reconnecting with seeing those in Rotherham Market. But we used to have that on bread. And so I was really fascinated by this Nigella Lawson. I think she made it really popular in England, but it's really popular in America as well. And so I'm interested too in the way that avocados became green gold, so that cartels, you know, this whole thinking about opium and what's traded. And so, you know, the fact that avocados have this title has been green gold and profit making. But actually the other side of that is that they need a lot of water for them to ripen and, become viable fruit. So, kind of connecting with the environment and, global warming and how we move things from one region to the next, how particular fruit and veg become popular. Thinking about jackfruit, for example, that, there's a whole culture around not eating meat and veganism, and so particular fruit like jackfruit is a good substitute for vegan. So just thinking about the way these kind of interconnected realities.
Yes.
And so I collected these, I've got hundreds of these avocado trays and just stacked them over a long period of time. And so part of the colour system is partly how they're faded over time, and then in certain shops they have different tonal qualities. So stacking them, I started to be also interested in the way when one's looking historically at geographical structures.
Like the strata of rock.
Yes, exactly. And how one could measure, cultural paradigms, structures growing, historical moments. I like that connection with the natural world. So some of the structures I wanted to be taller than others. And so this taller one, its shape they're all held, in fact, by these crocheted structures that go all the way through, kind of thinking about, so there are formal things happening as well as thinking about history, thinking about not having things, the idea of making use of what you've got. So, being able to collect detritus, really, but
and
also
turning it into something. So there is this kind of this transformation of sort of everyday materials. But to me, it seems that there's a kind of a thinking through making in terms of, that kind of intuitive sense about working with materials and how they then find their form. If we can move on to the next slide, please. I think it's really important to also to acknowledge, which I think you have with kind of looking at the different work, is also the importance of place and about how place can also influence your work. So here's a wonderful photograph of you when you're actually down in kind of residencies in St Ives. And it was whilst you were at St Ives working in this phenomenal kind of studio, which was, the former studio of Barbara Hepworth, and were allowed the opportunity to use marble gifted to you by the Hepworth estate. But also it was when you were there that you became interested in crocheting, is that right? Because of seeing the fishermen and the sort of sense about how fishermen's nets are made as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I was always interested in macrame, knitting and embroidery and so on. And it's been really good over the years to find that actually I could combine all these different facilities as another way of working and talking about ideas in the work. And I was really fascinated by the fishermen who have space in the basement of Porthmeor who still make their own nets. At one point they were making nets for general fishing but make it for their own use now because nets are made commercially. But it was really fascinating seeing how they strung up fishing line and made these really kind of macrame like netting, knotting and so on, that also connects with sailing knots, some of those kinds of similarities. So I was also collecting bits of granite from Penwith and collecting secondhand knitted cardigans and stuff in the Salvation Army shops, and I was really interested in the seams of cardigans and jumpers, so I cut the seam and made, so I was able to tie little blocks of granite and make a little votive thing. So also the yellow structure around this scaffold, and all this scaffolding was stored in the hallway in Studio 5 where Patrick Heron worked for a long time. I liked so it was really cold in this studio in the winter, and so logs came in these log bags, which look rather like bags that fruit and vegetable are also contained in. And so, as well as warming the studio, I loved these bags and started to sew them together. And so I like the connection between found and made objects. I love the yellow lichen in the whole of Cornwall, and the lichen really, this particular yellow lichen really is indicative of good air. So I was fascinated by, the kind of rosette structures that the lichen made. So it was just really lovely to be in the studio where I collected bottles as well. So one of the things about spending time in the basement with the fishermen was finding a plastic bottle in one of the lobster pots, And so the first day I was there in Portsmouth, there was a water outage. And so most of the water, the bottled water had gone. And so I was just thinking about this complicated world we're in, where, surrounded by sea. And then, of course, the water would have to be processed for us to drink it. And then all the water had gone from the shops. And so I started making work at this point using water bottles and, just using stuff around that was very much part of the culture, but also connecting. It was also really exciting to be invited to do the residency at Portsmouth because it really connected with some of my earlier invitations to St. Ives in Barbara Hepworth's studio.
And I love the connection going back to the beginning, that actually in terms of, looking at the commission for the Windrush Commission, that actually the marble that you were using when you were in St. Ives, which was, that was given to you by the Hepworth estate, but then also about how marble again comes back in again in the most recent in the commission, doesn't it, in relation to thinking about the soursop being made of Carrara marble, which I think is really, really, really fascinating. I know we're quite short on time now, so what I'd like to do is to open this up to some questions. And one of them that, first of all, is I would like to ask you about whether you think that trauma and healing and whether that has a place in the work. I know, for example, that pillows are a kind of recurring kind of, they occur from the early work. We can go to the next slide, and then you can sort of see that in terms of relic and the pillow of dreams. And certainly pillows feature quite prominently, I think, in the more recent shows that you've had, for example, at the Art House in Wakefield, and then also in terms of thinking about your recent show at Spike Island. So maybe what we'll do is, if we can just go to the next slide after this, then I think people can kind of have an opportunity just to sort of see this again, this sense of kind of strata, but being kind of articulated in a different way. Could you say a little bit about healing? Because that also relates back to stitching, doesn't it, in some ways?
Yes, so there was I'm interested in some of the readings about my work and all these grants and so on. It sounds as though I've had this seamless, linear, successful career. But there was a whole period where I wasn't getting grants or support for work. And so I was making a lot of work. It connects, of course, with collecting those days and so on. But there was a whole period where I was sort of just making work with what was around and thinking about, there's been quite a lot of trauma in my family. There's been a number of suicides and so on. And thinking about how one manages trauma, which isn't only intergenerational trauma, it's also trauma that one might be experiencing, and how one find ways of, dealing with the everyday world. And so the early pillows, big plaster pillows, were kind of pillows, but also landscape, body-related structures. And then so it was really lovely to be invited to do the residency at the Art House. It was one of the projects that I was invited to after a long period of not been invited to do work in public spaces. And so the little brochure to that is called Salvage. And of course, it's the title of this work. So salvage is also a kind of excavating, it's a kind of resituating oneself in the present, also finding ways of, how does one salvage
You can salvage a situation, can't you?
Yes, exactly. And exclusion, and how, various people have said, well, artists' careers tend to be like this in a way, that you might have moments of visibility and then, moments where you're not that visible. But it's quite complicated, that whole period, if you're having moments of a lot of exposure. During the 80s, the work was quite visible and then it seemed to disappear. And so finding ways to keep going and not be totally disappointed in oneself and the world, and connecting. So some of these pillows are actually medical pillows.
Yeah.
I like the way that medical pillows are, made specifically to heal various parts of the body, and that also during pregnancy, their particular pillows are comfortable, so that you could sleep and have comfort. But I quite like the connection with the body, with healing ruptures. So the pillows, the landscape pillows, extended into becoming pillows of healing and that comfort the body, during the process of, if you break your hip or something in another part of the body, or recovering from major surgery, there are these pillows that kind of are quite comforting. So this salvage, the big pillow, is rather like a big rib cage, and also it's sort of, there's an interior part of it. So I made these big needles that held the pillows together. So there is also this contrast between the notion of the needles holding the medical pillows together and healing, but there's also this element of kind of dysfunction,
Yeah. And it's fragile. I mean, I think I've got lots of great questions coming in, which I'm going to have to put to you in a minute, but I also would like to just also make the connection in terms of your use of sewing, because also the sewing, that sort of sense of about, on the one hand, like I know, the back stitch is a way of connecting the past with the present, but also there's that sense of sewing as a way of kind of repair. And I think, that sort of sense in terms of like thinking back, to your childhood and the learning about the use of, about patchwork, but also a lot of the work that's in your Spike Island show, you have that sense of kind of sewing really coming to the fore. I mean, if we can just jump through a couple of slides, if we could just go to the final slide, or actually maybe we'll stay on this, if we keep going, maybe we'll stay on this and then we can just look at that. I mean, hopefully people can see, again, this kind of sense of actually, your use of kind of very particular materials. One of the questions I've got that's just come in is, it says, does the choice of material reflect directly from the intent or meaning of the work?
Both. Going back to part of what I said earlier, is that having a collection of things around continues to be very important in the way I work, but also because I've had a history and still use plaster. Plaster is still a central material. Also, just thinking about one's teeth, for example, I'm also always fascinated by going to the dentist and those structures, which this yellow plaster is one of the plasters that the dentists use to make structures of our teeth and so on. So there is an intentionality, also just collecting things. So there's one piece here where I've been collecting mushroom boxes and stacking them. So stacking comes into the work in different contexts, and wrapping is still very much part of how I might bring structures together. And some of these crochet mats, rather than using lead foil, which I don't use any kind of lead at all now, I'm thinking about growing up as a child, and crocheted doilies were very much part of how objects in my mom's house and my friend's house, and in France as well, you see a lot of crocheted structures. I think of things as structures, I suppose, in lots of ways, but finding different ways that these are part of. So, for example, that yellow doily is a coconut is on it, and that's actually bronze. I like the fact that you're not quite clear always what the material is. So I'm also interested in ambiguity, that you don't always quite know that you're experiencing something from being confronted with the work, and that it eviscerates your own momentum, and you're not quite clear. You could identify specific structures, but you're not quite clear about them. That is also an important part of the work.
Yeah, but it's like, I always just think, really, I mean, there is phenomenal sense of about you, the kind of the meaning that is created through the process of making, which is what I've always, which is what I love so much about it, and just how incredibly sophisticated I think your manipulation of materials is, and exploring the kind of the metaphorical potential, and it's kind of at that interface, which is where I think the kind of the meaning really resides. I have just a couple of other kind of quick questions. Somebody's asking about where in Hackney is the Windrush Commission, and it is actually it's just, what's the name of the square, Veronica? Is it called, it is just literally by Ridley Road Market, but forgive me, in terms of, it's Hackney Central you go to, is the nearest train station, but can you remind me of the name of the square by the church? I've forgotten.
Well, it's right by the St Augustine Tower, which which is fascinating. I really love that space because it really connects up with, the medieval and the architectural side of that part of Hackney, that it was once a woodland, and very marshy around there, and different groups of people have moved through Hackney. So there are lots of ways that work. Soursop, the breadfruit, and the custard apple. And of course, according to where you come from, custard apples have different regional names. So, gosh, I think that's part of what I was saying about.
Yeah. That's fantastic. I think that's a brilliant point to end on. I just want to say I've so loved talking to you about the work. I just think it's absolutely phenomenal. I'd just like to thank everybody for joining today. Can I let you know that the Centre will have its next online programme, which will be a conversation which will take place in the new year on Friday, January the 21st at 12 p.m. ET time, with artist Prem Sahib and Alex Lowry, who is a curator at the Dear Art Foundation. I think really this is just an opportunity to end now, and to thank again Veronica for her time, and for me to also thank Yale for inviting me to have this in conversation with Veronica. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Clarrie. Thank you.
Bye-bye.